Hey guys, thanks for joining us again for another one of our Devos. Just so you know, these Devos are going to be at least changing, if not coming to an end here pretty soon. As we're welcoming people back into the church, we are obviously going to have attention on other things, and so we'll do our best to continue to send these out to you, but I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. Unless, of course, there is great demand and you guys go crazy on the comments and the shares and all that good stuff. But today, we're in the book of Job. We've been in the book of Job for a little bit here, but not during the time that we've done a devotional. So just as way of review, we know that Job was a righteous man, very godly in his time, and Satan goes to heaven, which is a very interesting story in and of itself. By the way, we've taught through the book of Job before. If you want to check it out, it is either on the app or it will be soon. But regardless, Satan goes into heaven and he begins to dialogue with God. Not something that many of us would think about, I don't think at least. And God says to him, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And we go, "Lord, what sort of cruelty? Why on earth would you ever do this?" And the reason why in the end is because even though Job was going to be absolutely taken through the ringer, that he in the end would still give glory to God. And he would learn what submission looks like. For him to bow down in chapters 38 through 42 as he listens to God give to him all the reasons for why Job has no right to call him to court. We see that Job submits, and in the end, God gets all of the glory, and we find that Job has everything restored to him, even more than what he had before. It doesn't take away the fact that he lost much. We saw in the first 3 chapters that he lost his 10 children. He lost all of his possessions. All that was left was his wife. Now, his wife gets a bad rap as the nagging wife who says, "Curse God and die," but put yourself in her shoes. She lost everything. She had lost her 10 children. This is an incredibly difficult place to be in. And so she looks at her grieving husband, and in what I believe is a moment of weakness, she says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" But then Job, as he's mourning, as he is scratching his boils with the shards of pottery, in come his friends. Now, when his friends show up, they're a great example of what friends ought to do. They sit there with Job for a very long time, just mourning, as they look at this former man, essentially, as he's just sitting there. He doesn't look like a man to them. He looks like someone who is disease-ridden, someone who has lost everything. He is grieving. He is a shell of a human, and his friends just sit there with him. I think it's a great lesson for us as friends. A great way for us to mourn with those who are mourning is just to be present with them. Our presence can be the best present that you can give to them. But then, unfortunately, they open up their mouths and everything changes. Today in our reading, we have chapters 8 through 10, and we get Job's second, quote, friend speaking to him, and this is Bildad. Now, when Bildad opens his mouth, we learn a lesson on how not to be a friend, right? Listen to the first thing he says to him. This is the first thing that Bildad has said to Job the entire time that he's been there. He says, "How long," in verse 2, "will you speak these things, and the words of your mouth be like a strong wind?" Job, you're arrogant, in other words. The words that I'm hearing, you're just blowing smoke, because Job is essentially questioning God. And we find that Bildad is firm on his theology. His theology, in some aspects, is absolutely accurate. And what Bildad decides to do is he decides to defend his theology rather than comfort his friend. And so his defense of theology is the defense of the fact that God is just. And so when he's speaking, it's all about the justice of God. But what he's missing, in his mind, the justice of God is if you're good, good things will happen. If you're bad, bad things will happen. And you go, yeah, your theology is technically accurate that God is just, but the way you think God is just is absolutely inaccurate. Your application of your theology is terrible. And I find this is very common. We get so dead set on our theology, defending our theology, that instead of doing what we ought to do, and in this instance, it's bringing comfort to a friend, instead, we choose to defend our theology. If you love your theology more than people, you're wrong. If you love your theology more than God, you're wrong. And if God can't come in and reveal to you how your theology is wrong, you're twisted in your view. And that was Bildad. Bildad was convinced he was right. And so rather than putting his arm around his ailing friend, instead he insults him. And he goes on in verse 6 to say, if you were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for you and prosper your rightful dwelling place. That's his version of justice. If you were upright, good things would be happening to you. So Job, just confess this imaginary sin that we know that you're absolutely committing, that Job is not committing. Just confess it, and then God is going to restore everything. Now notice what he goes on to say in verse 8. He says, for inquire, please, of the former age, and consider the things discovered by their fathers. For we were born yesterday, and know nothing. Might be the best thing he says. Because our days on earth are a shadow. We see that it's been said that for some people, the past is a parking lot, and for others, it's a launching pad. For Bildad, the past was a parking lot. He just wanted to camp out there, just wanted to park and stay right there with, the wisdom of the ages. Listen to the people who have gone before us, Job. And what he's doing is he's living in the past rather than using the wisdom of the past to propel him forward in his understanding of God. So he gets stuck there once again, and he goes off basically saying to Job, God is a good gardener, and he wouldn't uproot a good plant if there was nothing wrong with it. Essentially saying, Job, if there must be something wrong with you, because God's not going to uproot you unless you are walking in a wicked way. Now, we see Job's cry in chapters 9 and 10. It starts off in verse 2. He says, truly, I know it is so, but how can a man be righteous before God? He's saying, listen, I know that I'm righteous, but how can I be righteous comparing myself to God? That's essentially where Job lands. Now, as the chapter goes on, he is calling God to court. He is saying, I wish that I could go to court with God just for him to explain to me why I'm guilty, because I believe that I'm upright. We see Job's theology is wrong too. He's assuming that if something bad is happening to him, it must mean that God is the one who's attacking him. When the reality of the situation is that God was allowing Satan to attack Job so that, we know from, I think it's the book of James, so that God would receive more glory in the end. So he goes on to ask him here in chapter 9, verse 14, how then can I answer him and choose my words to reason with him? How can I stand before God and say, all right, God, let me prove to you why I'm innocent. He explains his point in verse 19. If it is a matter of strength, indeed, he is strong. And if of justice, who will appoint my day in court? Though I were righteous, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, it would prove me perverse. If I'm standing before God, even my blameless mouth is going to be perverse, right? As I stand up in front of perfection personified, obviously, my imperfections are going to be seen very clearly. Although I am blameless horizontally, man, when I look vertically, I am absolutely not blameless. And then he says this great, I don't know if he stumbled across it or what, but this great observation, 32 and 33, for he, speaking of God, is not a man as I am, that I may answer him, and that we should go to court together. Nor is there a mediator between us who may lay his hand on us both. So a mediator was one who would go in between the two. He would listen to one side, he would listen to the other side, and in the end, he would put his hand on both sides, giving his judgment. He was the go-in-between. Job is crying for a mediator. I wish I had a mediator. Now, the reason why Job wanted one is to prove his innocence to his friends and to understand his situation. Why am I in this predicament? But amazingly, what Job is crying out for, thousands of years later, at the coming of Christ, would be answered. Because we know that we have a mediator now between us and God. That mediator is the person, Jesus Christ. He is the go-in-between. He's the one who came to man to show us who the Father was. And he is the one who then represents us as he goes to the Father. He is the great mediator. Now, chapter 10, Job goes on, but I want to finish this point of the mediator, because look at his conclusion in verses 21 and 22 of chapter 10. He says, before I go, he's asking God, just give me a moment of reprieve. Just give me a little bit of comfort, right? It's like Lazarus, or the rich man, actually, who's in Sheol, and he says, just tip your finger in a little bit of water and put it on the tip of my tongue. Just wants this moment of relief before he dies. And here's his conclusion of what will happen after he dies. He says, before I go to the place from which I shall not return, to the land of darkness and the shadow of death, a land as dark as darkness itself, as the shadow of death without any order, where even the light is like darkness. What Job doesn't realize he's doing here is he's giving us the picture of somebody, of what their death will look like if they don't have a mediator. You see, once we have a relationship with Jesus Christ, once we have that mediator, that go-in-between, we now can look to death not the way that Job does. We can look at death as a transition. It's ultimately an upgrade for those of us who know the Lord. We're passing from this life onto real life. Job didn't have that mediator to explain that to him. Job didn't have Jesus coming down and explaining to him who the Father was, but we do. Job didn't have the one who had gone before him to bear his sin and his guilt upon him, but we do. So when we go through trials, tribulations, difficulties, may we not look to God as the cause. Say, why are you attacking me? Instead, recognizing that if anyone's attacking, it's Satan. And if anyone can redeem, it's God. And then when it comes to the end, say, Lord, if you're going to take me, then take me, because I get to be with you. Not like Job. Job is hopeless at this point, saying, just give me a little bit of comfort right now, because when I die, I'm going to go to the place of utter darkness, where even light is like darkness, a place of total separation from God. And we know that that is the reality of those who don't know Jesus, but fortunately for those of us who do know Jesus, that's not our reality. All right, guys, as we continue through the book of Job, we're going to find a lot of repetition, but something that I want you to see kind of consistently is the theology of these friends is causing them to not comfort their friend. And if we have theology, again, that we're holding on to, more so than wanting to comfort or wanting to show love to people, we need to put that theology in its proper position. Love must trump our theology. All right, guys, love you guys, and we will see you again back tomorrow at noon.